The United States has a complex tax system that can differ from that of one's home country. For that reason, there are many tax issues non Americans should be aware of when purchasing real estate located in the United States. I'm Leanne Lee, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. On today's episode, we'll discuss the acquisition of U.S. real estate by non Americans, the tax consequences, and steps to take to minimize the tax impact. We're joined by private wealth partner George McCormick, who is located in our New York office. In his practice, George focuses on tax and estate planning for international clients with a connection to the United States. Welcome to the show, George.
Thanks, Leanne. Happy to be here again.
So, to start us off, what are the main tax issues or consequences non Americans should be aware of when purchasing U.S. real estate?
Well, the most important thing that I would inform a non American of who's considering purchasing U.S. real estate is if they purchase that real estate in their individual name and then later pass away, that asset is subject to U.S. federal estate tax. On prior podcasts, we've talked about U.S. federal estate tax mostly for Americans, U.S. citizens, and U.S. residents, and the exemptions that they're afforded against the estate tax. But for non US citizens, non US residents, while only a few types of assets are subject to US estate tax, real estate is one of them. And notably, for non US persons, they only have a $60,000 estate tax exemption amount. And the highest rate of tax is 40%. So, as an example, let's say a non US person purchases a New York City apartment for $10 million, which is not really that unrealistic in New York at all. At a $10 million value, there's a potential almost $4 million of estate tax exposure. So it's very important for clients to be aware of this potential tax issue before purchasing U.S. real estate.
Now, you mentioned estate tax concerns for non Americans buying real estate. What steps can someone take to minimize their tax exposure?
The most important step is to not purchase the real estate in their own name. If it's in their own name, then it's fully subject to estate tax. I'd also mention that they should not use a limited liability company to purchase the real estate either. Other than individual ownership, a LLC is the most common type of purchaser I see for US real estate because of the liability protection. But an LLC is transparent or see through from a US tax perspective, so it provides no protection against estate tax. So there are other types of structures and strategies a client should consider before purchasing the real estate. There are a few different types of commonly seen structures. Either a non US company is the owner of the property, or a non US company that owns a US company which owns the property, or a trust. In some circumstances, perhaps partnership. The reason why we use these structures, because with the non US company, if the client passes away, they die owning a non US company and not the underlying US real estate. With a trust, we would structure the trust in such a way that the client doesn't have too much control or interest in the trust that would put the asset, the real estate, in their estate.
Okay, let's change gears. Are there income tax issues to think about when buying U.S. real estate?
Yes, the client should definitely be thinking about income tax planning as well. Estate tax is a given for any non US person that is purchasing US real estate. So when they're looking at a type of ownership structure, the income tax issues often dictate what type of structure they utilize. And the income tax issues are often directly related to the use of the property, right? So is it a personal use property where maybe there's really no income or little income? Or is it a personal use property and rented some? Is the property owned for purely rental income or rental yield, or capital appreciation, or a combination of all of these different things? And so we look at all of those issues, and then we look at the client's particulars and the country they live in and things like that. And that's how we arrive at an ownership structure that we recommend.
And now, what are some other issues to consider when purchasing U.S. real estate?
Well, one other tax issue I'll mention here first is that in addition to the federal estate tax, there are certain states that impose a state estate tax, like New York does. So, this is even more of a reason for a non US person who's considering purchasing US real estate to create some sort of ownership structure. Aside from taxes, what I tell clients is that it's very important to try to get this ownership structure in place before they purchase the property. If the client purchases the property in their individual name, it is very difficult, almost impossible, to get that property into some sort of estate tax protected structure. So it's very important that the structure is in place before closing and that the trust or the company or whatever legal person it is the one that takes ownership at closing. And to me, ideally, that ownership structure is in place before the contract is signed. So, in most places in the US, purchasing real estate is sort of a two-step process. You look at the property, you like the property, you make an offer, and then once the offer is accepted, you sign a contract and you put down, for example, 10%. And then there's 30, 60, 90 days, something like that. There's due diligence. And then the second part is the closing. To me, really the ownership structure should be in place not only at the closing, but by the time they sign the contract. One reason is because there's maybe some sort of quirky, sort of gray tax issues about if you change the name between signing the contract and the closing. But the other issue from a non-tax perspective is that if you have a person in their individual name sign a contract and then they say they want to change the name of the purchaser before closing, that can sometimes scare sellers and can make things kind of strange and awkward in the deal and maybe even make them want to back out. So again, just to reiterate, it's very important that they get the structure in place. I'll also add that we're trying to minimize US taxes here, but we don't want to create unintentional issues from a non-US tax perspective. We want the client to have advice from a lawyer or tax advisor in their country of residence to make sure the structure that I'm suggesting works for that country as well.
Clearly, there are many issues to consider before buying U.S. real estate. So, what are the main points you would like clients to take away from this?
The first thing that they should be aware of is that if you're a non-US person and you purchase US real estate in your individual name and you pass away, you'll be subject to US federal estate tax on that asset and almost on the entire value of the asset at a 40% rate. Therefore, they should consider some sort of ownership structure, whether it's a corporation, a company, a trust, that's the purchaser of the property. They should get tax advice from an advisor who understands these issues to make sure it's structured properly. And they should also be consulting with an advisor in their home country to make sure there's no unintentional tax issues in that country.
Well, as always, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Leanne.
If you have any questions for George, his contact information is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided in Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.